Welcome to Pioneer Mindset, a place where we challenge our mindset and address the discomfort in both business and life by finding clarity resulting in bold conviction. I'm your host, Garrett Ruskamp, fifth generation farmer, husband, and father from rural Nebraska. Whether you're navigating frustration from past decisions or worry about the uncertainty you face today in your business, we're going to learn from our struggles and take on new challenges with a resilient mindset. Join me as I share my journey of struggles I faced in agriculture as a farmer and family man. I'm ready to dive into honest conversations to tackle the mindsets surrounding key issues that rural ag business owners face that will ultimately help you gain control, leading to a profitable and sustainable business. Let's adapt to Pioneer Mindset and get to it. Welcome back, everyone. For this week's episode, I want to talk about conversations with our banker. Now, I think this is something that's always good to keep an eye on or kind of be mindful of, but especially as you hear this, we're probably getting closer to renewal season for your line of credit. So these are going to be the times of year where we're going to be having these conversations with our banker. Now, back on episode 32, if you had a chance to listen to that one, I kind of talked a little bit about this as well on preparing for financing for next year and basically thinking like your banker. And to kind of recap that loan just a little bit is I talked about how there's kind of nervous times ahead for these bankers and kind of how they might be thinking about different things as we get into this next year's renewal season, looking at probably getting financing for 2025 or maybe any projects that you're looking at doing. So I want to kind of continue this a little bit, but dive a little bit deeper into this. And I think the big thing about this is just being proactive before we go into these conversations. Now, a little side note here is sometimes I can actually be one that I think when it comes to having important conversations, I tend to be like, well, let's just kind of wing it. And the reason I come up with that kind of mentality is because in the past where I may have kind of getting this all written down, kind of play it out in my head, how I think that the conversation is going to go and how I want it to go. And then I get in there and maybe something takes a turn, not necessarily a turn for the worse, or just does not play out necessarily like I thought it would. And so then I tend to come up with the mentality, well, let's just wing it. Well, I think we can all agree, or maybe you've been in that situation to where if you wing it, it does not go necessarily, kind of like I said before, like you want it to go, or maybe not as good as it could have been if you just put a little bit of preparation into it. If we prepare ourselves a little bit and be proactive with some of these conversations and think about them a little bit more, maybe it's just a matter of, okay, this is how I want the conversation to go. This is what I want to say. This is what I want to talk about. This is the point I want to get across and how I want to say it. Maybe some of even your nonverbal communication kind of tones there. Maybe think about all those things and be prepared that it's not going to go that way. But if you can have that preparation going into the meeting, that you can at least expect an outcome a little bit better than just winging it. Because even though that is sometimes my mentality, we all know that it's always going to be better to prepare for these conversations a little bit, maybe write something down, maybe get it down on a piece of paper or just kind of role play it in your head a little bit, just so you have a little bit more preparedness going into these conversations. I think that's definitely going to help your case, definitely going to help put the power back in your hands a little bit more into these conversations. Now, as we get into talking about some of these conversations, some of these, basically thinking like your banker, maybe thinking from a little bit of a different perspective. I mentioned kind of nervous times ahead coming into 2025, maybe coming off of the end of 2024, where depends on your situation. Maybe you're in an area where you did not have a bumper crop. Yields are maybe not as good as you would have hoped, or maybe the prices have obviously dropped significantly from, say, the beginning of 2024. So these are some things that bankers are well aware of. And so you're probably thinking, well, how do I really train my brain to think about this differently? So I was trying to simplify this a little bit when I was thinking about how I was going to basically portray this. But think back to when you were, a kid. Maybe you were in, junior high or something like that, and you had to loan a friend $20 for something, and you're nice, you're generous. You loaned them that money, and you are fully aware that they're going to try to pay you back at some point. And unless you establish some really hard contract terms and conditions, which we all know we didn't do that. You just were aware that at some point you're going to get paid back. But then maybe over time that the friend wasn't able to pay you back. Maybe he got into some trouble. Maybe his allowance got taken away and he wasn't working as much as he should have been to bring in some money to pay you back that $20. Now, I know that might seem like a very minute amount, but as we think back to a kid, sometimes that was a big amount and you wanted to get your money back. So maybe it came time for him to ask for some more money. And are you going to loan him that money? Are you going to loan him it just free and clear and just not worry about it and not expect to get it back? Or are you going to be maybe a little bit nervous about how you're going to go about this? Are you going to be asking some questions, or when you're going to be able to pay me back? When am I going to receive this money? Are you going to pay me any sort of additional compensation for me having to wait this long? Kind of like interest, so to speak, in layman's terms from back when we were a kid. So these are some things that I was trying to think about. When you think about it in that perspective, it's like, okay, yeah, I would be a little bit nervous if I was the person loaning somebody else the money and not being able to get paid back, or just worrying about their current situation, how they're going to be able to pay me back. So I think that's kind of a little bit different perspective there. And it kind of gets us in the minds of kind of what the bankers are dealing with. And another thing, when it comes to all these bankers, you got to realize that to a certain extent, they're not necessarily the high man on the totem pole. They're probably kind of the lower man on the totem pole. It depends on who you're dealing with at your specific bank. And the reason I say that is because, yes, they are aware of, say, the current ag economy and the state of the economy, maybe locally, what things have done as far as yields and prices and all of that stuff. But some of this nervousness that they might be portraying across to you and some of the stipulations that you're having to deal with could actually be coming from the top down. And I say that is in maybe the board meetings that they're in, that they have to basically answer to, or they have to take all of these loans to try to get approved. They might be actually the ones putting some of these harder restrictions on that they have to implement or they have to abide by. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the banker is just kind of a go-between between your operation, and the board, whoever decides who actually approves the funding that you need to operate. And so that's one thing we can kind of keep an eye on or remember, is that some of the things that they're portraying may not necessarily be coming directly from them, but they have to abide by them. They want to keep their jobs. They want to keep their nice cushion, comfy salary, as well as, being able to provide funding to different operations as well. So these are things to kind of keep an eye on or kind of remember as we get into these conversations. So as we want to start working through this, when it comes to conversations with your banker, one of the things that they're going to be asking for that you're going to be responsible of basically reporting to them is basically a cash flow. Especially when it comes to kind of an annual basis, getting a line of credit, you're going to need to provide them a cash flow. Now, what does that look like, or how do we go about this process? Well, it just kind of depends on you and your situation and what has worked in the past, and maybe what has not worked in the past. Now, typically for most people, most operations, this might be just simply providing your banker with your acres that you're going to be planting this next year, maybe your acres of each crop, maybe your livestock inventory, when you predict to sell those, what your expected price is for those. Kind of same to go back to the crops, what your expected price is for those. Now, in some cases, some people are very vague whenever they give this information to the banker, and essentially their banker is going to take this and they're going to be the ones that create this cash flow, which I'm going to stop you right there. If this is you need to realize that this is not the best way to do things. You're putting this cash flow that is so variable, that's relying on so many different variables, that is basically your operation. You're allowing somebody else to basically create this cash flow for you. And I believe this is a problem, and this is something that we need to consider changing if we want to take back the control within this conversation. And so going back to how people sometimes do that is they'll just give them kind of the information that the banker needs to create that own cash flow. And then they take it and they run with it and they do what they need to basically, put together this cash flow. That way they can take that to their loan committee and try to get your operating loan approved, or whatever kind of loan that you're after at that current point. And so this can be a really big problem, because how accurate do you think somebody from the outside looking in is going to get your cash flow that is highly variable, that can honestly be hard for the farmer themselves to come up with, because things are moving constantly? How accurate do you think they're going to portray your operation from a cash flow standpoint? Well, I'm just going to put it bluntly. They're not going to be that accurate. It's not going to be a proper representation of a cash flow from your business and how you're operating, because things change so much. Even though you might give them kind of the gist of what your operation is going to be doing for this next year, things are going to change all the time. You're the only one that knows more about your operation than anybody else. So kind of keep that in mind as far as building out a cash flow. Now, also when it comes to these cash flows, and also the other thing that they're going to be looking for is all of your assets and your liabilities, so that way they can go and create a balance sheet. And the one thing that they're going to do with all of this information is you're going to give this to them, maybe bare bones, maybe give me the balance sheet from last year. I'll scribble on it what's updated, what we've done different, what I expect things to be. And then they're going to take it and they're going to plug it into their own system. That's just the way that bankers work. Every bank has kind of their own system that they plug all this information into, that they're going to analyze and kind of keep track of it on their own end, which is fine. I think that's completely understandable and completely acceptable. The thing here that I want to be aware of that I think we need to be doing is asking for a copy. Ask for a copy after they go ahead and implement all of that into your system. Now, I want to tell you a little bit of a story here. I guess before I go into that, the reason that we want to ask for a copy is because we want to see exactly what they have put down. Maybe you gave them bare bones information, so you want to see exactly what they put down, so that way, yes, even though you're asking somebody else, you're being vulnerable and asking somebody else to put together your information and portray that to a board that's going to basically determine whether you get financing for the next year. You want to make sure that it's accurate to the best of your knowledge. So you're going to take that, basically the copy that they give you, and you need to review that the best that you can with a fine-tooth comb, or just make sure that everything looks pretty darn accurate to what you think it's going to be, because that's what ultimately they're going to be basing their decisions off of. Now, to kind of go back to the one thing that I mentioned before is I had a customer that did this. They entered all of their information, or they submitted everything to their banker. And then from then, the banker put it into their own system. And he came back with, well, they're not going to be able to do this line of credit because the cash flow doesn't look very good. Well, I said, well, what do you mean? This looks just fine on the tool called Pharmametrics that we're currently using that we've reviewed several times. I said, this looks just fine. You've got a pretty positive cash flow between your two businesses here. Why doesn't he want to fund it? And so I said, well, we need to get a copy. We need to get a copy of what he's basing his decision off of, because that could be different. That could be different from what we gave him. And that could be different for multiple different reasons. Maybe it's different because he made a mistake. Maybe it's different because we actually made a mistake. And so we need to make sure that, like I said before, that copy that he has, that's what he's going to be taking a loan committee. That's what everybody on that board is going to be deciding off of. So we need to make sure that is accurate to the best of our ability. And so whether that kind of keeps us in check to make sure that we're doing the best that we can. So in this case, we did not actually see a copy at that point. We did not see a copy of what he had put together. But I said, okay, well, let's go back and actually review what we sent him specifically, because maybe there's some discrepancy there. So we went back and kind of reviewed what we had sent him. And it was actually on our end. It was on the system that we were using. We had double entered some different things, and there was some things that needed to be fixed up, and that was basically on our end that we made some mistakes. So there's a couple different reasons, like I mentioned before, that we want to ask for this copy. It's to hold ourselves accountable, but also hold them accountable. We need to know what they're putting into that. And the one thing that I want to mention here, kind of going back to nervous times ahead, is some of these bankers may potentially be looking at stretching the truth a little bit. Now, at the end of the day, they want to provide you financing. They want to provide that loan to you, keep you as a customer. But if things look tough, if things look like you're not going to make any money, you're actually going to lose money, it's going to be a negative year, they're going to look at, well, maybe we need to stretch the truth a little bit. Rather than using your insurance guarantee, we're going to use your APH for yields. That's going to change things significantly from a cash flow standpoint. And you got to realize that this is not necessarily a good thing. Because if they're willing to change things and stretch the truth, are they really in your best interest? Are they really have your operation's best interest at heart? So we need to keep this in mind, that sometimes these things will happen. And I can tell you a personal story that at one point in time, I took in a cash flow to our banker, and I'm pretty conservative sometimes when it comes with these cash flows. I just think I'd rather not be surprised in a negative way. I'd rather be surprised in a positive way. So I took this cash flow projections, some break-even projections to the banker, and I said, well, it doesn't look good, but this is the reality of it. And so he he said, well, after looking it over, I can't take this to loan committee. They're never going to approve it. So we need to look at maybe trying to change these things a little bit. And that can be a problem, folks. And if you don't realize it's a problem, then maybe you've probably been there as well. And so that's one thing that they can definitely do is they might look at potentially stretching this truth a little bit. So by asking for a copy of the things that they do, the cash flow or even the balance sheet that they put together, it's going to hold them accountable, but also like I mentioned before, it's going to hold us accountable as well. So these are definitely some things that we need to keep in mind. Another thing here that I want to mention real quick is when it comes to putting together a cash flow, especially in years where things do look tight or margins are going to be really tight and it doesn't look positive, a lot of these bankers, and maybe even on a good year to be honest, a lot of these bankers might be looking at inputting our spouse's basically salary in there. If your spouse works off farm, maybe she works in town, maybe she's got a good paying job and she's providing farm to your household income, and you're basically applying for this loan, this operating loan for your operation, and everything's kind of maybe run through your bank account, or even if it's not, if you're kind of the sole proprietor here as you operate, sometimes bankers are going to be looking at basically adding in that $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 salary that your wife makes in town to make your cash flow look better. And this here, folks, is another problem that we need to be aware of, because even though it's going to look better, it's going to make us feel warm and fuzzy, we're going to be able to get our financing for next year, this is all great, we're going to keep farming on like we love to do and we really enjoy, that's what we want to do here is keep farming. But at the end of the day, if we're asking another salary to basically subsidize this business here, is that doing us any favors? Is that doing us any good to basically be subsidizing our farm by our spouse's salary? And basically, by doing that, you're taking away from what that salary that your spouse earns is going towards. Because generally, that salary might be the one that actually puts food on the table for your family. That's one that takes care of the car payment when the farm is not doing well. And so by inputting that into a cash flow for your business, you are doing your business a discredit, and you're not doing it any favors, and you're not being truthful with yourself, because if it can't cash flow and you need to subsidize it, then how sustainable is this business truly going to be? So these are some things here that we definitely need to keep an eye on that bankers can sometimes try to do. And I'm not trying to portray bankers as bad people. They're just trying to get you approved so you can keep farming. They're trying to keep your board approved by keeping your loan on the books as well. So just kind of something to keep an eye on there and be mindful of. Now, as we get to wrapping this up, a couple things to remember here. We need to take ownership of our numbers. We need to take ownership of the cash flow that we're providing them, of the information that we're providing them, and we need to do the best of our ability to make sure that is accurate. Some ways that we can do that is we need to be responsible putting together the cash flow ourselves. Let's not rely on our bankers to put this together for us. Now, I know this can be kind of cumbersome to do if you've never done this for the first time, and I'm more than glad to help you with this because there's multiple ways that we can go about this. But let's try to realize what is our actual cash flow for next year. What are our different income streams? Maybe you're diversified. Maybe you've got crops and livestock. Maybe do some custom work. We need to account for all of this the best of our ability to make sure that things are accurate. And we need to take ownership of this so that way we can provide accurate information to our banker, who is ultimately the go-between between us and the loan committee that approves our loans. And so then another thing here is when it comes to trying to provide our numbers is we need to be a steward of our numbers just as you are steward of the land. And I think that's one thing we can always resonate with is if you're a farmer or even a rancher, is the land, the resources that we have that we operate by, is we are stewards of them. We want to take care of them. We want to do the best of our ability to take care of the land and to keep it in better shape than when we found it or when we received it. And so I think if we can be a steward of our numbers in that same format, that's going to provide us, basically a better trajectory into the future. Now, the next thing here I want to ask you a question is, if you don't focus on your finances, who will? And I've maybe said this a few times, maybe you've heard me say this, but if you don't focus on your finances, who will? Or the other question is, what's the alternative? What's the alternative if you do not provide your banker with accurate financing? Maybe it's your situation is looking kind of bleak going into this next year, but you kind of cushion things a little bit. You just want to get your funding for next year. Is that doing you a credit or them a credit? Or what's the alternative if you do not focus on getting them accurate information? Maybe you get a year or two down the road and it's going to really bite you in the rear end. So what's the alternative? Now, as we go about this, as we get to wrapping this up, ultimately what we're trying to do here is put the power back into your hands and take control of these conversations, because we're trying to be proactive on these conversations. We're trying to be proactive as we get our financing going into next year. And these are just some things that we need to do to take the power back into our hands and to take the control back of this situation, take control back of finding financing, take control back of being a steward of your numbers, like I mentioned before. So I hope this all makes sense to you. I hope you've resonated within this conversation. And if you have any questions or whatever, just love to reach out and try to learn more as to how you can take back control within these conversations. Please reach out to me. My name is Garrett Ruskamp, as we all know, with Pioneer Mindset, but as well as with Pioneer Farmer. So reach out to me. I would love to help you with that. But for now, that's all I got, and we will catch you next time. Thanks for tagging along with me today as we sharpened our mindsets. If you've gained insight from today's episode, be sure to take a screenshot to share or send this episode to somebody who might also find value in it. For more, follow me on Instagram at Garrett Ruskamp or on Facebook, and join me next time for more conviction through clarity.